Discover the hidden world of survival that history forgot, where enslaved people risked everything to stay alive. From ash cakes baked in secret fires to dangerous midnight possum hunts and communal gumbo prepared with foraged shellfish, these 25 meals reveal incredible stories of resilience, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit. Corn mush. Our journey begins with perhaps the most basic yet essential survival food in the enslaved person's diet: corn mush, also known as pone bread. This wasn't just food, it was the foundation upon which countless lives were built, one spoonful at a time. Corn mush was essentially a simple porridge made from the rationed cornmeal that was boiled with water. But here's where the ingenuity and desperation intersected beautifully. Enslaved people would secretly supplement this bland, barely nutritious base with foraged greens they found in the woods, stolen milk when they could manage it without being caught, or any other flavor enhancer they could get their hands on. The preparation of corn mush was an art form born of necessity. It had to be prepared quickly in their cramped cabins, or even out in the fields, always with one eye watching for overseers who might punish them for adding unauthorized ingredients. Imagine the skill required to enhance this basic meal while working under such dangerous conditions, knowing that being caught could result in a whipping or worse. What makes this meal particularly heartbreaking is that it represents the absolute bare minimum of survival. This was often all that stood between an enslaved person and starvation, yet they found ways to make it not just edible, but meaningful. Mothers would prepare it for their children, adding whatever nutrients they could find to help their babies grow strong, despite the circumstances trying to break them down. Moving from the basic to the ingenious, we encounter ash cakes, a preparation method that perfectly demonstrates how enslaved people adapted Native American techniques to create something life-sustaining from almost nothing. Ash cakes. Ash cakes were made by wrapping cornmeal dough in collard leaves and baking them directly in the hot ashes from a fire, a technique that enslaved people learned from observing Native American cooking methods. But the genius wasn't just in the preparation, it was in the secrecy of it all. These cakes were made secretly in the fields during brief breaks from backbreaking labor, specifically to avoid using plantation resources that might be noticed by overseers. Picture this: a person who has been working from sunrise, bending over in cotton fields or rice paddies, using their precious few minutes of rest to carefully wrap cornmeal in leaves and bury it in ashes, all while keeping watch for anyone who might report their actions. The collard leaves weren't just packaging, they were often foraged secretly from wild plants, adding both nutrients and flavor to what would otherwise be just basic cornmeal. These leaves also prevented the dough from burning and added a subtle, earthy taste that helped mask the often poor quality of the cornmeal they were given. The name itself, ash cakes, speaks to the humble, almost desperate nature of this meal. These weren't baked in proper ovens or prepared in well-appointed kitchens. They were literally cooked in the ashes of fires, using whatever heat was available, often in hidden locations where enslaved people could prepare food without detection. Perhaps no food item better illustrates the resourcefulness of enslaved people than our next entry: hoe cakes. Flat cornmeal cakes that were literally baked on the metal blade of a hoe over an open fire. The very name tells you everything you need to know about the desperate circumstances that led to their creation. Hoe cakes. Hoe cakes were flat cornmeal cakes baked on a hoe blade over an open fire, often eaten with foraged berries. But think about what this really means. Enslaved people were so restricted in their access to proper cooking implements that they had to use their farming tools as cooking surfaces. These were prepared at night in their small gardens, hidden away from the main plantation buildings, specifically to supplement their inadequate daily rations. The night preparation wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival. Cooking during the day would have drawn attention, and attention often meant punishment. The foraged berries that often accompanied hoe cakes represent another layer of risk and ingenuity. Enslaved people had to know which berries were safe to eat, where to find them, and how to gather them without being caught venturing too far from their assigned areas. These berries didn't just add sweetness, they provided crucial vitamins that were completely absent from their regular rations. What makes hoe cakes particularly poignant is how they've survived in Southern cuisine to this day. Many people enjoy hoe cakes without realizing they're eating a food that was born from desperation, created by people who had to use farming tools as cooking equipment just to avoid starving to death. Our next entry represents one of the most enduring legacies of enslaved people's culinary innovations, though few people today realize the desperate circumstances that led to their creation and refinement. Grits. Grits were made from ground hominy, processed corn, that was boiled into a porridge and flavored with whatever could be obtained, often stolen bacon grease. But the real story of grits lies in what enslaved people did to transform this basic preparation into something that could actually sustain life and provide some semblance of nutrition. The secret preparation involved cooking the grits using garden-grown herbs that had to be cultivated in hidden plots, all to enhance the bland rations they were given. Think about the incredible planning this required: growing herbs in secret, harvesting them without detection, and then using them to improve a meal that was already being prepared under dangerous circumstances. The stolen bacon grease mentioned in historical accounts represents one of the most dangerous aspects of secret food preparation. Taking even a small amount of fat from the plantation kitchen or smokehouse was considered theft and could result in severe punishment. Yet it was often the only way to add the calories and flavor necessary to make grits truly sustaining. What's remarkable about grits is how enslaved people managed to turn what was essentially animal feed, coarse ground corn, into something that could provide real nourishment. They developed techniques for grinding, cooking, and flavoring that transformed this basic ingredient into a food that could help people survive the most brutal conditions. Our next entry stands as one of the most culturally significant dishes in our list, representing a direct connection between enslaved people and their West African heritage, prepared in secret to maintain both physical survival and cultural identity. Hoppin' John. Hoppin' John consisted of black-eyed peas and rice simmered with pork scraps, maintaining its status as a West African staple that was adapted to American plantation conditions. But the true story of this dish lies in how it was cultivated and prepared under the most oppressive circumstances imaginable. The black-eyed peas were grown in hidden garden plots, and the entire dish was prepared communally at night, away from the watchful eyes of overseers. This communal preparation wasn't just about efficiency, it was about preserving community bonds and cultural traditions that the system of slavery was designed to destroy. The secret garden plots where the black-eyed peas were grown represent an incredible act of resistance and planning. These weren't just random vegetables planted anywhere, they were carefully cultivated crops that required knowledge of soil, seasons, and agricultural techniques that enslaved people had brought with them from Africa and adapted to their new environment. The pork scraps that flavored the dish were often the only animal protein available to enslaved people. The leftover bits that weren't considered good enough for the plantation owner's table. Yet enslaved cooks managed to transform these scraps into something that not only provided essential nutrients, but also carried the flavors and cooking techniques of their homeland. The next entry represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of how enslaved people created complex, flavorful meals from foraged and stolen ingredients while maintaining deep connections to their African culinary heritage. Gumbo. Gumbo was a stew thickened with okra that included shellfish or wild game, maintaining its West African roots while adapting to available American ingredients. But the preparation of gumbo under slavery required an incredible level of skill, knowledge, and risk-taking that most people today can't imagine. The foraged ingredients that went into gumbo were added secretly to mask any theft that might have occurred in obtaining the more valuable components. This means that enslaved people had to be expert foragers, knowing which wild plants, shellfish, and small game animals were safe to eat, and where to find them without being caught venturing too far from the plantation. The okra that gave gumbo its distinctive thick texture was itself a connection to Africa. Enslaved people brought okra seeds with them and managed to cultivate this vegetable in their secret gardens. The shellfish component of gumbo required access to waterways and the knowledge of tides, seasons, and fishing techniques. Enslaved people living near coastal areas often risked punishment by venturing to gather oysters, crabs, and other shellfish during their limited free time, usually at night or during brief breaks from fieldwork. Up next, we dive into collard greens with pot liquor, which represents one of the most nutritionally important secret preparations in the enslaved person's diet, providing essential vitamins and minerals that were completely absent from their official rations. Collard greens with pot liquor. Collard greens were boiled with pork fat, and the nutritious liquid called pot liquor was sopped up with cornbread, creating a vitamin-rich meal. But the real innovation came when wild greens were secretly substituted or added to supplement the cultivated collards. The foraging knowledge required to safely identify and gather wild greens was extraordinary. Enslaved people had to know which leaves were edible, which were poisonous, and which provided the most nutrition, all while gathering them secretly from fields, forests, and areas around the plantation where they might not be supposed to venture. adventure. The pot liquor, the nutrient-rich liquid left after cooking the greens, was perhaps more valuable than the greens themselves. The pork fat used to cook the greens was often obtained through dangerous means, either stolen from the plantation kitchen or saved from the small portions of fatty meat that might be included in their rations. This fat wasn't just for flavor, it was essential for helping the body absorb the fat-soluble vitamins in the greens. The cornbread used to sop up the pot liquor was itself often enhanced with whatever additional ingredients could be found, perhaps wild onions, herbs, or even stolen eggs when available. This combination created a complete meal that could provide substantial nutrition from ingredients that cost the plantation owner virtually nothing. Up next represents one of the most emotionally complex dishes in our exploration, a food born from the cruel reality that enslaved people were often given only the parts of animals that their oppressors considered inedible or disgusting: chitlins. Chitlins were made from boiled or fried pig intestines, seasoned with peppers and other available spices. But the true story of chitlins lies in how they were obtained and prepared, often from pigs that had been stolen and butchered in the woods to avoid detection. The preparation of chitlins required extensive knowledge and skill. Pig intestines must be thoroughly cleaned and properly cooked to be safe for consumption, a process that takes hours and requires access to plenty of water and cooking facilities. Enslaved people had to master this complexity. Preparation while working with limited resources and always under the threat of discovery. When chitlins came from stolen pigs, the entire process, from theft to butchering to cooking, had to be completed in secret, often in wooded areas away from the plantation buildings. This required coordination among multiple people, all of whom were risking severe punishment if caught. The fact that enslaved people could transform what were essentially waste products into something nutritious and culturally meaningful speaks to their incredible resourcefulness and refusal to be dehumanized, even when forced to eat parts of animals that their oppressors considered beneath them. Pig feet. Pig feet and hog maw represent another category of foods that emerged from the systematic denial of quality nutrition to enslaved people, who were forced to make sustaining meals from animal parts that plantation owners discarded. Pig feet and hog maw were boiled with beans to create a high-calorie survival food. These weren't delicacies, they were literally the discarded parts of butchered animals, but they were prepared secretly in groups, often in hidden locations away from the main plantation. The preparation of pig feet required patience and skill that seems almost impossible given the circumstances. These tough, gristly parts had to be cooked for hours to become tender enough to eat, requiring access to fuel for fires and cooking vessels that enslaved people often didn't officially have. The long cooking time also meant maintaining fires and watching pots while trying to avoid detection. The beans that accompanied these protein sources were typically grown in the secret provision grounds that enslaved people maintained, despite prohibitions against having their own gardens. These beans weren't just filler, they provided essential amino acids that, when combined with the animal protein, created complete proteins necessary for survival under physically demanding conditions. The group preparation mentioned in historical sources reveals the communal nature of these secret cooking sessions. Multiple families would often contribute ingredients and labor, sharing both the risks and the rewards of creating these survival meals. The next entry represents a perfect example of how enslaved people transformed the least desirable parts of animals into protein-rich, satisfying meals through African-influenced cooking techniques and carefully cultivated vegetables. Hama, hocks with beans. Ham hocks, smoked pork knuckles, were simmered with cowpeas in a preparation that maintained African culinary influences. But the reality of obtaining these ingredients was far more complex and dangerous than the simple description suggests. The beans were grown in secret gardens, while the ham hocks were often stolen from plantation smokehouses, making this dish a combination of agricultural skill and dangerous risk-taking. The cultivation of cowpeas required knowledge of planting, tending, and harvesting that enslaved people maintained despite having virtually no time or resources for their own agricultural pursuits. The ham hocks themselves were typically the parts of smoked pigs that contained more bone and gristle than meat, but they were invaluable for the flavor and some protein they could provide. When these had to be stolen, it required careful planning, knowing when the smokehouse would be unguarded, how to take just enough to avoid immediate detection, and how to transport and hide the evidence. The African influences in this dish reveal how enslaved people maintained their culinary heritage despite systematic attempts to erase their cultural identity. The combination of legumes with smoked meat, the long, slow cooking process, and the seasoning techniques all reflect cooking traditions that survived the Middle Passage and adapted to American ingredients. This next meal holds a special place in the survival foods of enslaved people, representing both a connection to their African heritage and an example of how they could create nutritious, satisfying meals from ingredients they could grow and prepare in relative secrecy. Roasted sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes were wrapped in leaves and roasted in ashes, maintaining connections to African yam traditions. This simple preparation method masked a complex reality of secret cultivation in hidden gardens and carefully timed cooking that had to avoid detection. The cultivation of sweet potatoes in secret gardens required considerable agricultural knowledge and planning. Sweet potatoes need specific soil conditions, adequate growing time, and proper harvesting techniques to produce the large, nutritious tubers that could help sustain life. Enslaved people had to maintain these gardens while working full-time in plantation fields, often tending their own crops by moonlight or during brief breaks. The roasting process, while simple in concept, required skill and timing. Sweet potatoes wrapped in leaves and buried in hot ashes had to be cooked long enough to become tender and sweet, but not so long that they burned or dried out. This cooking method also had to be done in locations where the smoke and smell wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Sweet potatoes were particularly valuable because they could be stored for extended periods without refrigeration, providing a reliable food source during times when other foods were scarce. They were also highly nutritious, providing vitamins A and C, potassium, and complex carbohydrates that gave sustained energy for grueling physical labor. Okra stew represents one of the most direct connections between enslaved people and their African homeland, while also demonstrating how they adapted traditional recipes to available ingredients and dangerous circumstances. Okra stew. Okra stew was made by boiling okra with tomatoes or peppers, using okra as a thickening agent in keeping with African culinary traditions. But the preparation of this seemingly simple dish required foraging for okra pods or growing them in hidden locations, often for both medicinal and survival purposes. The okra itself tells a remarkable story of cultural preservation. Enslaved Africans brought okra seeds with them, carefully hidden and preserved through the horrific journey of the Middle Passage. Once in America, they managed to grow this African vegetable in their secret gardens, maintaining not just a food source, but a living connection to their homeland. The tomatoes and peppers that often accompanied okra in these stews had to be carefully sourced. Tomatoes might be grown in provision grounds or foraged from wild plants, while peppers were often cultivated specifically for their preservative and flavoring properties. Hot peppers also helped mask the taste of foods that might not be perfectly fresh, important when food storage was limited. The preparation of okra stew often took place in communal settings, with multiple families contributing ingredients and sharing in the cooking process. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about maintaining social bonds and cultural traditions that the system of slavery was designed to destroy. The next meal represents one of the most important survival foods in the enslaved person's diet, carrying both nutritional significance and deep cultural meaning that connected them to their African heritage and their journey across the Atlantic. Black-eyed peas boil. Black-eyed peas were simply boiled with whatever herbs could be found, adapting what had been a shipboard survival food to plantation conditions. The fact that these peas were planted in provision grounds that had to be maintained in secret reveals the incredible planning and risk-taking required to maintain this food source. The reference to black-eyed peas as shipboard survival food carries enormous historical weight. These peas were likely among the foods that helped enslaved Africans survive the Middle Passage, meaning they represented both trauma and survival, death and hope. The fact that enslaved people continued to cultivate and eat them in America speaks to their practical nutritional value and their emotional connection to survival. The herbs used to flavor the boiled peas were typically foraged from wild plants or grown in tiny hidden plots near their quarters. This wasn't just about taste. Many of these herbs had nutritional or medicinal properties that helped combat the effects of an inadequate diet. The knowledge of which herbs were safe and beneficial represents sophisticated botanical understanding. Black-eyed peas were particularly valuable because they were high in protein, fiber, and essential nutrients like folate and potassium. For people surviving on diets that were often deficient in protein and vitamins, these peas could mean the difference between health and disease, energy and exhaustion. The next entry represents another example of how enslaved people managed to create protein-rich, nutritious meals by combining legumes they could grow in secret with wild greens they foraged at great personal risk. Cowpea stew. Cowpea stew consisted of field peas stewed with wild greens, providing an essential protein source. The preparation was typically done at night to avoid detection, revealing the dangerous circumstances under which even basic nutrition had to be obtained. The cowpeas themselves had to be grown in the provision grounds that enslaved people maintained despite prohibitions and severe limitations on their time and resources. These weren't random vegetables planted wherever space was available. Cowpeas require specific growing conditions and knowledge of planting times, soil soil preparation, and harvesting techniques. The nighttime preparation of cowpea stew speaks to the constant surveillance and control that enslaved people lived under. Even the act of cooking their own food was potentially punishable, forcing them to prepare meals in darkness, often in hidden locations away from the main plantation buildings. The stewing process required access to cooking vessels, water, and fuel for fires, resources that enslaved people often didn't officially have. They had to improvise with whatever containers they could find or make, gather wood without being caught taking plantation resources, and maintain fires without creating too much smoke or light. The next entry represents one of the most challenging and dangerous aspects of secret food procurement, requiring nighttime hunting skills and the ability to process and cook wild game without detection. Possum roast. Possum was trapped and roasted over open fires, typically as the result of nocturnal hunting expeditions. These hunting activities were conducted secretly with dogs or traps, requiring careful planning to avoid discovery. The hunting of possums required skills that many enslaved people brought from Africa or learned from Native Americans and other enslaved people. They had to understand animal behavior, know how to set effective traps, and have the courage to venture into woods and swamps at night when dangerous wildlife and potentially hostile people might be encountered. The processing of a caught possum required knowledge of butchering, skinning, and meat preparation that had to be learned and practiced in secret. This wasn't just about cutting up an animal. Proper processing was essential for food safety, especially when refrigeration wasn't available, and spoiled meat could cause serious illness or death. The roasting process typically took place in hidden locations in woods or swamps, requiring the maintenance of cooking fires for hours while avoiding detection. The smell of roasting meat could travel considerable distances, making these cooking sessions particularly risky endeavors that required careful planning and lookout systems. Our next meal represents another example of how enslaved people risked severe punishment to obtain protein-rich wild game that could supplement their inadequate rations and provide essential nutrition for survival. Raccoon stew. Raccoon was hunted and then simmered with whatever vegetables could be obtained, but the entire process was prepared in hidden spots to evade detection by overseers. The hunting of raccoons was particularly challenging because these animals are intelligent, nocturnal, and often found in areas that might be difficult for enslaved people to access without being caught away from their assigned areas. Raccoon hunting also typically required more sophisticated trapping techniques than catching smaller game. The hidden preparation sites mentioned in historical accounts were typically in swamps, deep woods, or other areas where smoke from cooking fires wouldn't be easily detected. These locations had to be carefully chosen to provide access to water, fuel for fires, and escape routes if discovery seemed imminent. The risk involved in hunting and preparing raccoon was considerable, not just the risk of punishment for unauthorized hunting, but also the physical dangers of nighttime hunting in unfamiliar territory, and the challenges of processing wild game without proper tools or facilities. The next entry, rabbit stew, represents one of the more accessible forms of wild game for enslaved people, requiring less elaborate hunting techniques while still providing essential protein that could help sustain life under brutal conditions. Rabbit stew. Rabbit was trapped and then stewed with onions and peppers when available, providing quick access to protein. The hunting typically took place at dusk when rabbits were active, but visibility was poor enough to help conceal unauthorized activities. The trapping of rabbits required knowledge of animal behavior and trap construction that enslaved people often learned from each other or adapted from techniques they remembered from Africa. Rabbit snares could be made from available materials like vine or rope and didn't require the more elaborate equipment needed for larger game. The timing of rabbit hunting at dusk reveals the careful planning required for these activities. This was often the only time when enslaved people might have a brief break from supervised labor, when rabbits would be emerging to feed, and when the failing light would help conceal their movements. The quick nature of rabbit as a protein source was particularly valuable because rabbits could be caught, cleaned, and cooked in a single evening, reducing the risk of discovery that came with longer hunting and cooking processes. This made rabbit hunting one of the more practical ways to supplement inadequate plantation rations. From one animal to another, the next entry represents another form of small game hunting that enslaved people used to supplement their diets, requiring different skills and techniques than ground-based hunting but offering accessible protein when other sources weren't available. Squirrel fry. Squirrel was fried with cornmeal coating when cornmeal was available, and the hunting was typically conducted secretly in wooded areas during brief periods when enslaved people could venture away from their work. The hunting of squirrels required different skills than trapping ground animals. Squirrels are arboreal and quick, requiring either accurate throwing skills, simple projectile weapons, or climbing abilities to reach them in trees. These hunting techniques had to be learned and practiced in secret. The cornmeal coating mentioned in historical accounts reveals how enslaved people managed managed to enhance even their wild game with the limited ingredients available to them. This coating wasn't just for flavor, it helped preserve the meat during cooking and provided additional calories from the cornmeal. The wooded areas where squirrel hunting took place were often the same locations used for other secret activities, like preparing hidden meals or conducting religious gatherings. These woods provided cover from observation, but also presented risks from wild animals, rough terrain, and the possibility of getting lost. The next entry, salted fish boil, represents an important source of protein that enslaved people could sometimes obtain through fishing activities, though this too required secret procurement and careful preparation to avoid detection. Salted fish boil. Salted fish like herring or shad were boiled with whatever greens could be obtained, but the fish typically had to be obtained through secret fishing in rivers and streams. The fishing activities required knowledge of where fish could be found, when they were most likely to bite, and how to catch them without proper fishing equipment. Enslaved people often had to improvise fishing lines, hooks, and nets from whatever materials they could find or make. The salting process for preserving fish required access to salt, which was often carefully controlled on plantations. When salt was available, it had to be used sparingly, and the salted fish had to be stored in hidden locations where it wouldn't be discovered and confiscated. The boiling process required cooking vessels and fuel for fires, resources that enslaved people often had to obtain through unauthorized means. The smell of cooking fish could also travel considerable distances, making these cooking sessions particularly risky in terms of detection. Our next entry represents an important source of protein that could be obtained through dangerous but potentially rewarding foraging expeditions to tidal areas. Oyster Reish clam stew. Oysters and clams were foraged from coastal areas and made into stews for survival, but this required gathering them at low tide without permission to leave assigned work areas. The gathering of shellfish required extensive knowledge of tides, seasons, and which areas were safe for collecting. Enslaved people had to know when low tides would expose oyster beds and clam flats, and they had to time their gathering expeditions to avoid both discovery and dangerous tidal conditions. The processing of oysters and clams required knowledge of how to safely open shellfish and how to determine which ones were safe to eat. Spoiled shellfish could cause serious illness or death, making this knowledge crucial for survival. The stewing process for shellfish was typically done in hidden locations near the water where the gathering took place, or the shellfish had to be transported back to safer cooking areas without being discovered. This required carrying containers and maintaining the freshness of the shellfish during transport. The nutritional value of oysters and clams was particularly important for enslaved people because these foods provided protein, minerals like zinc and iron, and other nutrients that were often completely absent from plantation rations. This made the risks of gathering them worthwhile despite the potential punishments. Up next, we take a look at wild greens, which represent one of the most important sources of vitamins and minerals that enslaved people could obtain through foraging, though this required extensive botanical knowledge and constant vigilance to avoid poisoning. Wild greens salad or boil. Wild greens like dandelions, poke, or turnip tops were boiled to create vitamin-rich meals, but they had to be foraged secretly from fields and wooded areas. The identification of safe wild greens required sophisticated botanical knowledge that could mean the difference between nutrition and death. Enslaved people had to know which plants were edible, which parts of plants were safe, and when they were at their most nutritious and least toxic. The foraging of wild greens often took place during brief breaks from fieldwork or during the limited time when enslaved people might be allowed to move around the plantation. They had to gather quickly and efficiently while watching for overseers who might punish them for not working. The vitamin content of wild greens was crucial for preventing diseases like scurvy that were common among people surviving on diets lacking fresh fruits and vegetables. These foraged greens often provided the only source of vitamin C and other essential nutrients in the enslaved person's diet. The next entry represents one of the most complex examples of food procurement and sharing networks among enslaved people, involving house workers who risked punishment to share food with field hands who had even less access to adequate nutrition. Juba, leftover stew. Juba was made from mixed scraps of meat, bread, and vegetables in a pot, typically consisting of leftovers from the plantation house. This dish was prepared secretly by house workers and shared with field hands. The procurement of leftovers from the plantation house required house workers to carefully collect scraps without being caught stealing food that was officially the property of the plantation owner. This had to be done systematically and secretly, often over multiple meals to accumulate enough ingredients for a substantial dish. The sharing network that brought Juba from house workers to field hands, reveals the solidarity and mutual support that existed among enslaved people despite attempts to create divisions between different types of workers. House workers who had slightly better access to food risked punishment to help field workers who were often on the verge of starvation. The preparation of juba required cooking facilities and the ability to combine disparate ingredients into something nutritious and filling. This often meant cooking in hidden locations and using whatever vessels and fuel could be obtained without detection. The communal nature of juba preparation and consumption helped maintain social bonds and cultural traditions that were essential for psychological survival under slavery. These shared meals were often accompanied by storytelling, singing, and other cultural activities that helped preserve African traditions. This next entry holds special significance as a dish that was not just about survival, but about resistance and hope, particularly in Haiti, where it became a symbol of liberation from slavery. Soup Joumou. Soup joumou was a pumpkin soup with meat and peppers that held special significance as a symbol of resistance in Haiti, and it was prepared covertly for special celebrations and gatherings. The pumpkins used in this soup often came from secret gardens where enslaved people managed to grow this nutritious vegetable, despite restrictions on their agricultural activities. Pumpkins were particularly valuable because they could be stored for long periods and provided both the flesh for eating and seeds that could be saved for future planting. The meat component of soup joumou was typically obtained through dangerous means, either hunting wild game or taking small portions of domestic animals without permission. The preparation of this meat had to be done carefully to avoid detection and to ensure food safety. The peppers that gave the soup its distinctive flavor were often grown in hidden garden plots or foraged from wild pepper plants. These peppers weren't just for taste, they also helped preserve the soup and may have provided some protection against foodborne illnesses. The covert preparation of soup joumou for celebrations reveals how enslaved people maintained cultural traditions and community bonds despite systematic attempts to destroy their social connections. These celebrations were acts of resistance that helped preserve hope and cultural identity. Our next meal represents one of the most direct connections between enslaved people and their African homeland, maintaining traditional preparation methods despite being made with different ingredients than those available in Africa. Fufu. Fufu consisted of pounded yam or cornmeal formed into balls and served with stew, maintaining West African culinary traditions. The yams were typically grown in secret gardens, despite restrictions on enslaved people's agricultural activities. The pounding process required for making fufu was labor-intensive and required tools that enslaved people often had to make themselves. Traditional African mortars and pestles had to be recreated from available materials, and the pounding process had to be done quietly to avoid attracting attention. The stews that accompanied fufu were typically made from whatever protein and vegetables could be obtained through hunting, foraging, or cultivation in secret gardens. These stews carried the flavors and spicing techniques of West African cuisine, helping maintain cultural connections across the Atlantic. Our final dish, kala, represents not just survival food but an early example of enslaved people finding ways to generate income through food. Preparation, despite severe restrictions on their economic activities. Kala. Kala were sweetened fried rice cakes that were often sold secretly to generate small amounts of income. These were prepared at night from surplus rice when it was available. The preparation of kala required access to oil or fat for frying, sweeteners when available, and cooking facilities that could be used without detection. The frying process also required skill to achieve the right texture and avoid burning the delicate rice cakes. The secret selling of kala reveals the entrepreneurial spirit that enslaved people maintained despite legal prohibitions on their economic activities. These small sales provided tiny amounts of money that could be used to purchase additional food, medicine, or other necessities. The nighttime preparation of kala demonstrates how enslaved people had to use their limited free time to engage in activities that could improve their survival chances. This preparation often took place after exhausting days of plantation labor, showing incredible determination and energy. These 25 meals are more than historical curiosities. They're reminders that even in our darkest moments, we can find ways to survive, to maintain our dignity, and to care for each other. That's a lesson we should never forget.